Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. Now, I have devoted a lot of time into clarifying some of the many things we mean by the word class. Class being obviously short for classification, kind of taxonomic or structural reality. For Marxists, class and class struggle, or the struggle between classes, is related to the modes of production, and it is a relationship between people in the process of reproducing material things, generally under capitalism, commodities. Commodities are things that have both use value, usually, and some abstract value on the market, which can be valorized in selling it. So class is your relationship to that production, which is not a relationship to just a thing, but a relationship between people. The bourgeois, for example, owns the means of production, but doesn't do the work. The lords, for example, own the land, but also don't do the work, but might fight for the land, etc., etc. In Marxism, this is a relationship that is not really based on your income per se, although that does come up because the bourgeois are inherently richer in their ability to command wealth than, say, the working class. Now, this is different from the general liberal conception of class, which is about income stratification. Stratified notions of class were also common and developed somewhat concurrently to Marxist notion of class, and people have tried to deal with them in various ways. And then there's class as social access or social categories. When I talk about social categories like lumpen or PMC or elite or professional, or white collar and versus blue collar, these are things that might entail parts of a relationship to production, although all of them might be profitable towards the bourgeoisie, and it might not be a bourgeois relation. But they also entail things that don't have anything to do with that. None of these deal with your class origins. So your class origins are the class which your family comes from and sets many things out for you. Nor does this have to do with the difference between a class in itself, class as an aggregate sociological or descriptive category. The workers, even in Marxism, often function as a class in themselves because we're describing a relationship within a capitalist matrix of society. But there's also the class for itself from Marx, and this distinction is when the class acts as a whole, moving from something like abstract aggregate into a organized block of society that has clear aims. Sometimes this is called a historical subject. Now, there's other things about this in Marxism, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Where does Habitas and class origins come in? And how does it affect things like PMC and lumpen and working class? Because we're talking about white collar and blue collar. Well, Habitas is an old concept. It's one of a bunch of categories in Aristotle. That's at least where I know it's relatively clearly attested. And in the categories, which is a work by Aristotle, Habitus is a quality that does not adhere naturally to a thing. It is different from its teleos, its hexis, which is its deep constitution, its dithesis, which I'm probably mispronouncing, which is its dispositions. It can be acquired through study and deliberation, but it is difficult to change. So your habitus is something that you can actively form, but once you formed it, it's hard to alter. Virtues are tied to habitus for Aristotle. Now, I also mentioned another term, hexis, and it's going to come back up. You might go, well, what does that have to do with class, and particularly class origins? Well, I'm going to give you a very, very, very short form of a development of a concept. Marcel Mauss, who was an anthropologist very interested in early human societies and gift cultures, etc., used the term habitas as an aspect of culture anchored in the body and in daily practice of individuals in society. So he expanded this, and particularly in his essay, The Techniques of the Body. Habitats are the habits you have that affect your body and mind that emerge through daily practices, rituals, both explicitly religious and not, that form your being and stuff that you do. And for example, when I was in Korea, I picked up the habit of like always holding the hand, or these very small cultural things that people do automatically in their culture as part of their habitus. Now, we still haven't got to what it means in sociology. So then there was also the use of habitus by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenologist. So we had anthropology start using this old category from Aristotle. Now we have the phenomenological thinker use the category from Aristotle. And habitus, it's habitual behaviors that arise on the basis of situations and responses that are understood communally. So very similar to Marcel Mauss's anthropological definition. But where habitus really gets its modern meaning in sociology and its relationship to class is the thinker Pierre Bourdieu, which says habitus consists of hexis, which is a person's carriage and speech, or what we might say posture and dialect and accent, mental habits of perception, classification, appreciation, feeling, and action. So they train both your ritual habits, but also are tied to your institution. And that these are a major component of culture. Now, we see hexis is an idea from Aristotle that is about deep constitutional things related to your soul, but are not passive or just dispositional. So, like your health is part of your hexis for Aristotle. But for Pierre Bourdieu, a person's hexis is actually part of their habitus because your posture is gained from mimicking people around you. Now, this version of habitus has often been critiqued, and I think somewhat fairly, as being overly deterministic. But there's a real truth to the fact that even the physical movements that you are instantiated to do, the way you give leverage, the way you relate to other people, are often modeled and reinforced in complicated ways by people in your class milieu. So we can talk about general dispositions that are common, although not universal, amongst people from certain class origins, because this sets up the way you are trained to talk and speak. So we can talk about, for example, the way middle class people who are white collar, who do intellectual work, either in a Marxist conception of petit bourgeois, meaning they own their own means of production, or Marxist conception are professional or intellectual wages, which just means white collar worker, often in a labor aristocratic mode, that sets up things about the way you think and speak. Now, your habitus is largely initially picked up from your family, but is also picked up from wider social institutions, which is where educational institutions come in. In my prior video on the rational core of both the PMC and elite theory, Redux, I talked about this to some degree. There are certain ways of interacting that are picked up in higher education. Certain modes of signification that signify both cultural and social capital, which is the access to capital through social signaling. Pierre Bourdieu defined this as systems of durable, transposable disposition, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. That is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of the operations necessary to attain them. This is in Pierre Bourdieu's theory, outline of a theory of praxis. And this is in another piece called The Logic of Practice. Now, you might go, that's confusing. It's important to remember that Habitas, for Aristotle and philosophers like Giorgio Agamben will stress, that Habitas was a way of acting that trained you in certain dispositions that once you were trained in them were hard to break. They're habits. The word habit in English is related to habitat. But it's not the same thing as our modern habits, because modern habits are small things that we think of as like tics or small things you do. A habitus informs even the way you look to relate to others. Now, Marxists have been criticized, and socialists in general have been criticized by focusing on classes in their role of production, in the mode of production, relations of production, by missing habitus as an important factor of class. In fact, Fisher often argued this with Marxists. Marxists would push back that Fisher didn't understand Marx's conception of class. In fact, I have accused Fisher of that myself. And that he had a more cultural English view of class as your class origins, which was related more to medieval types of thinking, and in medieval itself being a somewhat contested category. So when we talk about bad habitus, are things that alienate you from other people because the habits you do set you apart, we're not just talking about things having to do with class, but class really does inform this. And this changes in small ways. There are small ticks and things that betray your class origins. Even for me, there's a few shibboleths that give it away that I'm not from as educated a set of origins as I sound like. My ability to, for example, forget to pronounce things with the affected foreign accent that Americans who are educated generally affect to prove their education by affecting a foreign accent around a foreign word. That's habitus. Because they're actually not pronouncing it the correct way in the original language either. It's like some simulacra or approximation thereof. And yet there are other things that indicate that I'm highly educated. The words I use, simulacra, habitas, Aristotle, etc. One of the reasons why I always push back a little bit on concepts like the PMC is a unified category, which I find to be kind of ridiculous, is that multiple people get the exposure to different educational levels, which change the habitus. But today, it is increasingly true that these are becoming more and more static, and less people are jumping those lines. Now, I do think we have to deal with them when we talk about class. We often mean many different things. We mean someone's class origins and its effect on their habitus, how they see the world, how they interact with the world. We mean their relation to production and other people in the modes of production. Who's your boss? Who owns the place you work for? Who gets the profits? Are you productive to those profits, or do you subsist on something that is not productive to those profits, etc., etc.? Those categories are real in the sense that they describe a real relationship, but do not reify them in thinking they are a fetish where the relationship is some unified thing that exists as a form in the world. It is relational. And you exist in multiple class frameworks. Whether you're higher, lower, or middle class is not necessarily your relation to production. It may be both your access to income and your access to social status in a sociological sense. And again, none of this even gets to when a class acts in itself or as an aggregate, where you're just describing the most likely statistical traits that emerge in a class grouping as a habitus, or when a class acts for itself, which means it's organized as a political actor with a collective imaginary, institutional organs, and can intervene on its own behalf as a unified group. And when a class is against itself, which does happen all the time. And even the bourgeoisie has sectors that are fighting other parts of the bourgeoisie, both as individuals competing for more and more profits, but also as sectors that have very different immediate interests. Now, they might have unified class interest in the broad, long sense, but they don't in the immediate sense. These are all problems that people talking about class should deal with. Otherwise, they're basically what we might call falling prey to the prestidigitation of words, or making a reification error, assuming that a category has some facticity, that it as a category beyond what it's describing. And this is always a problem, not just about class. It's a problem about anything. So when we talk about class and we're like, oh, that's a liberal notion of class, we're not necessarily even saying that it's wrong. We're saying it's not the kind of thing that X is talking about. But we do have to deal with the fact that what you do, like your active role of production and how you do it, might define your classes and mode of production, but where you come from might define your habits and dispositions. That's not the only thing. There's innate personality, I think, in a way that often Pierre Bourdieu did not account for, but nonetheless, we do have to deal with that. All those are structured and limited by our social situation and the training and exposures that we get around it. And your first mimicry is from people who raise you, and the people who raise you are going to be in your immediate social milieu. And they might be from different social classes, both in the nominal sense, like access to education or this and the other, or in this mode of production sense, where one of your family members is a peasant and the other is a worker, although we don't really have peasants in America in any real way anymore. But you get my idea. This means we do have to be able to communicate and change the way we talk about this on a regular basis. I'll put some of the sources on this in the show notes. Like and subscribe if you want more, and protect your peace. Hit the bell, and there's more behind the Patreon if you're so inclined. Take care.